Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Crime Time. I'm excited today because we have a new guest who hasn't been here before, and he is a DNA expert. I want to welcome for his first appearance on Crime Time, Mehul Anjaria. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello, Allison.
So I want to tell them a little bit about you. First of all, Mehul Anjaria has seen the front lines of all sides of the criminal justice system. He's been doing this for over 20 years. He's a member of the panel of expert witnesses of the County of Los Angeles Superior Court. In 2009, he founded MBA DNA Consulting to assist criminal defense, civil attorneys, and pro per inmates who are struggling with complicated forensic DNA issues in their cases. Mr. Anjaria's services include helping clients to understand the implications of the presence or lack of DNA evidence, reviewing DNA testing reports and documentation, providing expert witness testimony, assisting with the development of technical cross-examination, the collection of DNA evidence, and witnessing of DNA testing that will consume evidence, that is, evidence that could be destroyed after it is tested for DNA. Now, today we're going to be discussing that horrific crime scene in Ohio where 8 members of one family were murdered, including a 19-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy. Then we're going to talk about the horrible case of the dismembered mother of 3 who went on a date with a man she'd met online and never returned. And third, we'll talk about the wrongful conviction of Keith Allen Harwood and the DNA evidence that finally proved his innocence. And then we'll delve into a cold case about a prostitute that was solved after 18 years, and it was solved with the use of touch DNA. And we're going to have Mehul explain a little bit of that to us. So today I want to talk about the possible DNA evidence that might have been present at the crime scene in Ohio, and I want to focus in on what different police investigators will probably be looking for at the scene where the 8 victims were killed execution style. Now, these victims included 8 members of the Roden family, ranging from 44-year-old Kenneth Roden to 16-year-old Clarence Frankie Roden. And at 3 of those scenes, there were marijuana growing facilities. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, let me ask you, first of all, about what investigators at that Ohio crime scene, there are 4 of them, but what are they going to be looking for in terms of collecting DNA evidence? Where might they find DNA, since these were kind of cold-blooded execution-style killings? So what do you think they're looking at?
Right. It may not be immediately obvious where to look for DNA. Obviously, these are bloody crime scenes if victims are shot. So that may not be productive. But in terms of firearms evidence, there may be fired cartridge cases that were left behind at the scene. And believe it or not, even though a cartridge case is essentially exploded through a gun and ejected out, it might still have touch DNA on it from people that loaded the gun. So that's probably the first thing that I would look at. You also, I understand that some of the bodies had some bruising on them. So there may have been, in addition to the gunshot, some direct physical contact. So I would look for anything that looked like a weapon that could have been used in a beating, a baseball bat, a crowbar, anything like that. Again, you could swab the handle of that weapon and try to get the DNA profile of the attacker. Likewise, if there was a physical struggle, you would check the victim's fingernail clippings, because they may have scratched some of the DNA off of their attacker, and it really doesn't take much DNA to get that type of transfer that can be detected. In addition to that, you might have to get creative. So if the people that perpetrated this crime were rather comfortable and they spent some time there, they might have actually smoked a cigarette or drank a beer or ate some of the food in the house. So I would collect any kind of drinking vessel that looked out of place, cigarette butt, half-eaten fruit. You would look for evidence of ransacking. And again, you're looking for that touch DNA. If there was a safe that was opened, swab the handle of the safe. If there were dresser drawers that had been ransacked, you could swab those as well.
Now, do you know when you walk into a crime scene, they said that this was methodical and probably done, execution style sort of intimates that they were professionals and they knew exactly what they were doing. And one of the fathers of the victim said that they managed to get close enough to that family even though they had guard dogs. So they may have known that family. But say you walk in and you don't, it looks like a fairly clean, sterile kind of killing area in the sense that they are laying down on the ground and they were all shot in the head. How do you know what to swab? Do you go around and swab everything at the scene? I mean, maybe they leaned against something, the killers, or touched something. What is the clue to swab in that area, or do you try to wipe down the whole thing?
Well, that's a good point, and you can't swab everything. The crime lab is going to have a fit, and they can never test all that. The problem these days is that most of our DNA evidence is actually invisible. It's not a big blood stain or a semen stain. It's this touch DNA. It's DNA from drinking or something like that. So you have to kind of try to reconstruct the scene the best you can as to what might have been used and where are probable places that the assailant might have touched, but you certainly can't go and swab everything. But you need to spend a lot of time because you only have one crack at the crime scene.
Now, do you work with investigators who are there looking at other kinds of evidence and they call you over when you're on a crime scene? So if, I mean, what is kind of the role of the DNA expert as opposed to, say, other forensic investigators that are on scene?
Right. I think looking at, hey, what are you likely to get DNA from? What could be probative? And then what is the best way to collect that evidence? And, of course, store it.
But you have to try to figure out how it all went down, because that'll give you a sense of where everybody was standing, and you can check those areas?
You do have to, I guess, at least try to do a reconstruction on the spot to get the most likely evidence.
Right. Okay, so it probably requires a bit of imagination.
It does, absolutely. You have to be creative because these days anything can be DNA evidence. We can swab almost anything.
And do you think, I mean, have you found in your 20-year career that when it's maybe involves organized crime of some sort, that they do leave behind any kind of trace of themselves?
It's very hard not to leave behind DNA evidence. And even people who are somewhat wise to this, they don't think of the more minor things like the cigarette butt or putting their hand on a counter or something like that. So we know that there's always some exchange of DNA between a perpetrator and a crime scene. We also know that that perpetrator will take something from the crime scene with them, even if it's on the microscopic level.
Okay, now if you beat up somebody, which is apparently what happened with some of the victims in Ohio, and you're just using your bare hand, do you leave anything behind? I mean, if you were like punching somebody, is that touch DNA or does it have to be the fingertips?
No, and any part of the skin on skin contact could transfer DNA. So if somebody's punching somebody, it all depends on how much DNA a person has in their hand.
And that varies.
That varies. If you're sweating, if you're the kind of person who scratches their face a lot, you're going to have more DNA. If you have very dry skin, you just washed your hands, you may not leave behind as much.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, and now I want to also ask you if these dogs were touched at all, and there is some evidence that they somehow managed to get close to the victims, despite the fact that they had guard dogs, but if they were sedated and anybody touched the dogs, is it possible to get DNA off of an animal's fur?
It's possible.
By touch DNA, I mean.
By touch DNA, yes. Now, again, it's kind of hard to figure out where you would look. But I think what I would do is I would probably collect the collar and tags as evidence first, because that's a real concrete place.
To hold back a dog or something.
Yeah,
like
exactly,
okay.
exactly.
All right.
And then, I mean, I guess you could get creative and swab the dog's head or where they would most likely pet them or...
All right, now I want to move on to our second story. Our second story involves actually a woman who was dismembered. This is in the case of the murder of Ingrid Line. If you recall, Line was dating a man for a month that she'd met online, and then she went on a date with him on April 9th, and she came home, but then she was found not to be there anymore. Her lower arm, lower leg, and a foot were found in garbage cans by a homeowner who was checking his recycle bin. Additional remains were also found just yesterday, including a foot and a hand, and they were found at a recycling center. Seattle police have searched Line's home on April 10th, and they found a 15-inch pruning saw near the bathtub and an empty box of plastic garbage bags identical to the ones containing her body parts. John Robert Charlton, 37, has been charged with the murder, and he's pleaded not guilty. In an interesting move, his bail was raised from $2 million to $5 million at his arraignment. And that kind of actually struck me. And I know this isn't particularly your area of expertise, but it kind of struck me. This isn't somebody who has substantial means, but I think that based on the seriousness of the case and making sure that this person will not leave jail until they are brought up to trial, that bail was raised. What are your thoughts about that? Does that strike you as crazy high?
No, I mean, because you think of the Suge Knight case in L.A., and what was his bail? 10 million or something more like that?
But he also has a fortune. I mean, supposedly.
That's true.
I mean, this is like a regular person who's not in the entertainment industry. I was a little surprised. I mean, is that a bail that you've heard about?
I think in LA County, yes. I work a lot with pro-per inmates, and I see bail 2, 3, 4, 5 million, even with people who do not have means.
Okay. And how did you end up working with pro-per inmates?
Well, it started when I founded a private forensic DNA laboratory. So we started working not only with prosecution, but defense. And then I stumbled on this phenomenon of pro-per inmates in LA County Jail who can actually get money to have DNA experts appointed on their case.
Is DNA used in a majority of the cases against these guys? I mean, do you find that you're getting a lot of people asking for your services?
I'm definitely getting a lot of people asking for services because nowadays DNA is not just used in rape and homicide. It's used in property crime, in burglary, and things of that nature. A lot of times I'll go to court and I'll make the point that, hey, you could have collected DNA that would have solved the case.
And you didn't. And they didn't.
And you didn't,
right?
and that was an oversight.
Is there a DNA person at every crime scene or not?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, these days at a crime scene, you don't necessarily have a forensic scientist, the lab person. You have more of a technician or technical person out at a scene.
Okay, so they wouldn't even know how to do a lot of what we were talking about, say, in the Ohio murders?
Potentially.
Okay, all right. Well, let me ask you, in terms of the murder of Ingrid Line, where would you begin to look for DNA evidence? I guess, first of all, my first question is about those garbage bags. They have said, at least publicly, we've heard some commentary on the fact that the bags that the body parts were found in match the bags from her home. Now, is it possible? What kind of evidence could be on those garbage bags?
Well, this one I think is easy compared to Ohio. On the garbage bags, that's a good surface for fingerprints. It's not that difficult to get fingerprints from a smooth surface like that. So there's a number of techniques that will visualize fingerprints. The problem is that even if you visualize friction ridge patterns, it could be smudged or it could be partial, and it may not be good enough to compare. So again, we're back to DNA. You could swab where someone might have handled the garbage bag or tied it and try to get that touch DNA.
Now, but does it become problematic? This is a man that was in her home. She'd been dating him for a month. Could he have touched garbage bags while he was helping her straighten up? I mean, there's a defense aspect here that it makes that whole touch DNA thing a little bit more difficult when it's somebody within the home.
Well, that's exactly what the defense would be. The other problem with touch DNA is that we don't know when that DNA was deposited. So if I touch a garbage bag and it sits in my house for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, it could still be there.
Now, how do you get the fingerprints off of a garbage bag?
There's a number of different ways. I think probably super glue fuming would be the most popular. There's all sorts of fluorescent powders and laser lights and things that can contrast an image off of a garbage bag.
But that's not the best surface, like, I mean, to lift them off of.
Well, I think it's decent because it's smooth. Rough surfaces are good for DNA, but not good for fingerprints, and then the vice versa.
Now, in chopping up somebody like this, and if this man did what he is accused of doing, Charlton, what kind of evidence might be at the scene? What are police likely to be investigating there? And then what would you do if you went to the recycling center? Where would you be looking to find evidence? How would that work?
Well, I understand that at the residence there was the saw found in the bathroom. So you'd absolutely swab the handle of the saw.
Again, now, if you wipe the handle of a saw with the rag, does that get rid of the DNA?
Not necessarily. Because again, it's invisible, so you don't really know if you've removed it all, unless you just pour like a gallon of bleach on it or something that extreme.
But so it's difficult, like whereas you could remove your fingerprints, or unless he had gloves on the entire time, it's going to be very difficult. It's probably difficult to hack up your girlfriend wearing gloves anyway.
Right.
Or saw them up.
And I've got to believe that somebody who dismembers a body, they're going to cut themselves in the process. So there's a good chance that there's some blood evidence from the person who did the sawing as well.
Oh, really? So you think it's something akin to like stabbing somebody and having cuts on your hands?
Exactly.
Is that what you found in your experience?
Yeah,
that if somebody like tries to use a saw, that they will invariably have some sort of an accident? Yeah,
because going back to the stabbing, inevitably, if you're stabbing someone very hard, your hand's going to slip, it's going to hit the blade, and then the attacker's going to bleed as well. So I would think, you know, sawing up a body is pretty difficult and you're using a lot of force. There's a good chance that that person's going to cut themselves.
Would you be looking to say then a mixture of DNA at the crime scene with his blood and her blood?
Well,
or would you think you would find something separate?
You may find something separate. So you might look for the actual pattern of the blood stains. So if you see like vertical blood drops in a trail away from the bathroom, that might be consistent with the attacker cut his hand and he's walking away, a la like what we heard in the O.J. Simpson case. Yeah,
I mean, do you swab? I mean, this is an interesting thing because if somebody is bleeding and still move alive, the blood falls in a certain way. Is that correct? I mean, do you swab like for any kind of blood at a crime scene?
Not necessarily.
I mean, this must have been quite bloody if I mean, I can't imagine how you clean up that kind of a situation.
Right. You may see things that are obviously from the victim, pool of blood by the head,
Right.
arterial spurting on the wall, something like that. So you're looking maybe for blood stains that are out of place with the rest of the blood. But then you're also going to take random samples because mixed blood from two people looks alike at the crime scene. You just don't know until you test it in the lab. So you might look for those mixtures as well.
Okay, then what happens at the recycling center? What do you look for at the recycling center? Is that finding where the evidence, ends up? Does that help you at all besides the bags? I mean, is there anything on that actual body that's going to help you, on the body parts?
Well, considering the fact that, I know that the couple was dating. Again, you have the problem. If you were to find his DNA on her, I'm not sure that that tells you that much. But it's worth looking for other people's DNA as well, because again, the skin-on-skin contact could leave something behind.
Okay.
And I understand the body parts were fresh, so I don't think we're dealing with decomposition or anything like that that would really harm the DNA. So it's probably worthwhile doing some kind of, at least looking at it with like a light source to see if anything looks different on the skin, and you might want to swab that area.
Do you think they'll be able to tell with just the body parts, and they do have the head, how this woman died? Is there anything that might let you know based on what they've found in an autopsy?
Well, it sounds like they found like a good portion of the body, so I have a feeling that the pathologists have a lot to work with and probably will come up with a pretty conclusive answer.
Or maybe even with they do have the head. You could see reticular,
Exactly.
hemorrhaging in the eyes or something along those
Right,
lines.
bruising of the brain and all of this kind of stuff.
Okay. All right. Now, I want to move on to our third story. Kevin Allen Harwood, who was convicted in 1982 of killing Jesse Perrone and raping his wife, was recently cleared due to DNA evidence that proved his innocence. Kevin was a sailor at the time of the murder and was stationed close to the victim's home. A security guard identified Harwood as entering the shipyard in a bloody uniform. Prosecutor's case also relied heavily on experts who testified that the bite marks on the woman's leg matched Harwood's teeth. Now, the Innocence Project pushed for DNA tests of the sperm left at the crime scene, and the DNA turned out to be a match to one of Harwood's former shipmates, Jerry Crotty, who had died in prison in 2006. This is a pretty horrific case. I mean, I have to say, in terms of how much time this poor man actually spent in prison, an Associated Press investigation found that at least 24 men who were charged with murder or rape based on bite mark evidence have been exonerated since 2000. What is your opinion regarding the reliability of the bite mark evidence? And also, if there are bite marks on a person, would your preference be then to go for the DNA? I mean, wouldn't that be a good source? Would that be a good source of DNA evidence?
Yes. In fact, there are some of these bite mark cases where somebody had the foresight to, in addition to photograph the bite marks and sketch them, to actually swab for DNA. And we found where the DNA does not agree with what the odontologist concluded.
Oh, I'm sorry. And we're actually talking about Keith Allen Harwood. I called him Kevin by accident, but go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So sometimes you have the benefit of cross-checking the bite mark comparison with DNA, and we found that sometimes it does not agree. So thank God in this case we're discussing that there was a DNA cross-check with the sperm, because a lot of these cases don't have DNA that could be tested along with the bite mark. And there's way too many of these cases. There's a lot of forensic science that's coming into focus now, like the bite marks and like microscopic hair comparison, that we can go back and cross-check with DNA and find out that some god-awful mistakes were made in the past.
Okay, so do you think that it's inherently unreliable then, the bite mark evidence?
The problem is...
Without the DNA?
Yeah, because it's subjective, and it's not the type of conclusion where someone can stand up on the witness stand and say, there's a 1 in 38 million chance that it's somebody else. It's really just the opinion of that examiner, and the criteria are somewhat subjective.
Have you ever done that hair analysis when you first were in school? I had to do that kind of a hair analysis without the DNA. And is that also, I mean, at least in your experience, something that you find to be inherently unreliable too? I mean, I think this would be difficult for a scientist to think that this would be indicative of anything when it's just somebody looking at it.
Well, to me, it's an academic exercise, and that's the only time I've done it is in school. When I worked casework, the only time I would look at a hair under the microscope is to determine, is there a root that we could do the standard type DNA testing on.
Okay. And lastly, I want to talk about the murder of Crystal Beslanowicz 18 years ago in Utah in 1995. Beslanowicz was 17 years old when she died from a blow to the head. She was a prostitute, and her body was found along the Provo River. Years later, police were able to use a forensic vacuum to extract DNA from the rock used to crush the young woman's skull. Now, the DNA ended up matching Joseph Simpson. He'd been a resort bus driver in the area at the time. He was later arrested in Florida later that year. Now, what I want to talk about here is the whole evolution of touch DNA and how they were able to get touch DNA off of a rock. So when did this first become possible? I mean, this case goes all the way back to 1995. When did touch DNA start becoming useful?
Well, touch DNA in general became useful, I would say, late 1990s. And that's when we migrated over our DNA testing technology to something called STRs, which was way more sensitive. Now we're going to the next level, which is how can we do a better job of sampling at the scene to get even more sensitive? So in this case, the way that they got the touch DNA is with this wet vacuum technique, which allows you to get more DNA at the scene. You combine that with increased technology in the laboratory, and we can get very, very high sensitivity in DNA testing.
So it would be very likely that now we want to hold on to any kind of murder weapon here if it was touched by somebody. And I'm also curious, what about the combination of the two DNAs? I mean, like you have her blood on that rock and his DNA. How do you separate that out?
Well, if you have visible blood, then that's easy because you just would sample around the blood for the touch DNA. But you're not always that lucky. So how you sample something is going to bear on what the results are going to be. You want to try to avoid convoluted mixtures. So if you're lucky enough to have blood, it's easy to sample. But again, something like a rock that's been out in nature, several people might have touched that. And the more sensitive our testing gets, actually the more complicated the data is and the trickier the mixtures are to interpret. In this particular case, luckily they were able to get a nice profile from the touch DNA.
Let me ask you, in the area of DNA, we have the advance of the touch DNA, and this is a question that actually comes from my Facebook page from Jeff Greenfield, and he wanted to know what some other technological advances have been in forensics that have solved some cases for our guest, and also what can we look forward to in the future? What is the latest thing in DNA testing?
Well, in terms of what's on the cutting edge now is rapid DNA. There are instruments that can be deployed in the field where a non-trained person can essentially drop a swab into an instrument, 90 minutes later get a DNA result back.
Wow.
And I guess in terms of moving forward, as we just said, the testing is so sensitive and the data is complicated, we need better computer tools to sort out the data and sort out those mixtures. So there are a lot of programs coming out on the horizon that do what's called probabilistic genotyping, which is going to computerize a lot of this interpretation and help us to make better sense of some of these messy DNA mixtures that we come up with.
And is there a timing on who touched what when, or is that still missing from the equation?
That's still missing. I don't know that we'll ever solve that one.
No, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. If you have so many different people touching something, how you sort of narrow that down. So you still need kind of the footwork of figuring out what happened at that crime scene coupled with that technology. But it does sound kind of crazy. It's like you get it. What are the things that you used to not be able to get DNA off of that you can now?
Even a cigarette butt. In the early days, there probably wasn't sensitive enough DNA testing to get that. Anything with touch, real small blood stains, you might not get a full result from.
And what would you use instead? There's if you get some DNA, is there some way to make some use out of that?
Well, there is. So, earlier when the testing wasn't as sensitive, you might get a result, but it would be very partial. And so the statistical power wouldn't be that great. You might say, well, we found this DNA profile that 1 in 25 people in the world would have, which doesn't help you very much. And maybe if you went back with a newer technology and that same sample, you could get a sample that you could say, well, 1 in 38 quadrillion people in the world would have that DNA profile.
And when you testify in court, what do you think about the sophistication of jurors when it comes to this issue, this type of evidence?
You've got to keep it simple, but they absolutely are expecting it in every case now. They want to see it because of the TV shows and the familiarity. So they do have a little bit more knowledge on this, but again, you cannot lose them in the science. You have to show them what is the bottom line, why is it reliable, and what does it mean in the case.
Well, I want to thank you for being here. We are out of time, but I want to thank you, and I hope you will come back and join us as we go through different cases so that we can look at the evidence with you and learn a little bit.
I would love to.
Thank you, Mehul. I want to thank all of you for watching. Let us know what your questions are, and if you have more questions for for today's guest. And if you have any questions for me or any comments, post them on this page or reach out to me on Twitter, as many of you do. And we'll see you next time on Crime Time.